The call came at 2:03 in the morning, and by the second ring, I was already sitting up. Because nobody calls at that hour to say anything gentle. I snatched the phone off the nightstand and heard the nurse trying to keep her voice level. My mother was in respiratory distress. Her breathing had turned shallow and wrong. She was confused. Her pressure was unstable, and the ambulance had been dispatched, but the estimate was too loose to trust. 20 minutes. Maybe more. Maybe less. Too many maybes for a woman who was 86 years old and fighting for air. I was out of the bed before she finished speaking. My car had been in the shop since the day before, transmission trouble that had left me relying on my husband's Mercedes sitting right downstairs in the drive, like certainty itself. I did not stop to put on a robe. I turned on the lamp, crossed to his side, and shook his shoulder hard enough to wake him clean. "Sylvester, I need your keys, now. Mama's in trouble." He opened his eyes with the kind of irritation that belongs to a man being asked to move an inch, not a husband being told somebody might die before dawn. He did not sit up. He did not ask how bad it was. He rolled halfway onto his back, squinted at me, and said, "She's not my problem. She's yours. Fix it." The room went so still I could hear the air vent pushing against the dark. I stood there looking at him, really looking at him, and it felt like some hidden door inside my life had swung open without warning, not slammed, opened, clean, quiet, final. I said one word. "Really?" That was all. My name is Narvi Beaumont, and I wish I could tell you that word came from shock alone. It did not. It came from something older, from months of watching a man grow louder in rooms where he had once known how to listen, from years of making myself smaller so peace could fit inside this house, from seeing, in one hard moment, exactly what was left of my marriage when life stopped. Being convenient? I left him there and called Maxine Carter next door. Maxine was a widow with steady hands, soft slippers, and a way of seeing a household without ever prying into it. She answered on the first ring. "I need help," I said. "I'm coming," she said, and hung up. That kind of woman is rare. By the time I reached my mother's house, Maxine was already pulling up behind me in a sweater thrown over her nightdress and house shoes that slapped the pavement when she moved. The nurse had done what she could. My mother was conscious, but barely settled inside herself, her breath thin and uneven, her eyes unfixed in that frightening way old people's eyes get when the body is working harder than the soul likes. Verdell Beaumont had always been proud of living on her own. Seeing her folded into that chair with a blanket around her shoulders made something hot rise in my throat. But I pushed it down because panic wastes time. We moved fast and careful. Maxine took one side. I took the other. The nurse kept speaking low to my mother while we got her out to the car. The ride to the hospital took under 15 minutes, though it felt like my heart had been dragged across every second of it. Maxine drove like a woman who understood urgency without turning foolish. I sat in the back with my mother, holding her hand, telling her she was not alone. Somewhere between the emergency doors and the waiting room chairs, leave me a comment telling me what time you're watching. Because I know some of y'all understand exactly what it means when a night splits your life into before and after. They took her behind the curtain, and I was left under hospital lights that made everybody look exposed. Machines hummed, shoes squeaked, a television bolted high in a corner whispered news nobody in that room had the strength to care about. I did not cry. I did not pace. I sat down, unlocked my phone, and sent one calm message to the bank relationship manager, requesting an 8 o'clock protective review call regarding operating authority, continuity exposure, and pending discretionary movement. Then I sent an urgent, confidential email to Nathaniel Griggs, my father's old attorney. I placed the phone face down on the plastic chair beside me, folded my hands in my lap, and exhaled, for the first time that night. Hospitals strip a night down to its ugliest truth. By the time the worst of the rush passed and the staff stopped moving around my mother with that sharp, practiced speed that makes everybody nearby feel helpless, the room had gone quieter than I liked. Not peaceful, just quieter. Her breathing had steadied enough for the nurse to stop glancing at the monitor every few seconds. Maxine had gone home only after I made her promise to get some sleep. The plastic chair under me felt harder by the minute. The vending machine down the hall kept humming like it had somewhere better to be. And with nowhere left to put my hands except folded in my lap, my mind went backward. Not to comfort, to evidence. There had been a time when Sylvester was easy to trust. That was what made the rest of it so bitter. If he had started out arrogant, I would have known what I was dealing with. If he had walked into my father's company like a man already convinced he belonged at the head of something he had not built, my father would have shut that down early. So would I. But that was not the man he was then. In those first years, he was careful with power. My father noticed that before I did. Thaddeus Beaumont had spent too much of his life reading men in conference rooms and contract meetings to be dazzled by Polish alone. He watched posture, listening, restraint. The things people reveal when they are near money that does not belong to them yet. Sylvester asked smart questions. He came prepared. He did not pretend to know what he didn't know. And when my father corrected him, he absorbed it instead of defending himself. That went a long way with a man like mine. And there was a practical side to it, too. One we never had to say too loudly because all of us understood the world we were moving through. My father had built that company from the ground up, but he had also lived long enough to know that some rooms still relaxed faster when a man was at the head of the table. Sylvester could occupy those rooms. He had the voice for it, the look for it. The kind of steadiness people mistake for authority before authority has actually been proven. Behind him was where I worked best. Those years did not feel like sacrifice. They felt like structure. He handled public leadership. I handled the bones underneath it. Before major meetings, I would prepare him at the dining table or in the car, or standing side by side in the kitchen while coffee brewed. I told him which vendors needed patience and which ones respected bluntness. I warned him which executives loved flattery and which ones distrusted it on sight. I taught him how to hear fear disguised as confidence and greed disguised as urgency. He listened. That was the key. He listened. And because he listened, he carried the company well enough in public for the arrangement to work. It worked because he still understood the difference between being supported and being made. The shift did not come loudly. It came the way rot gets into wood. Quiet first, then structural. He landed 2 major contracts close together, both of them built on relationships I had been tending for years without fanfare. The articles quoted him. The dinners celebrated him. Men who had once looked past him began leaning in. At first, he came home amused by it. He would repeat things those men said with a half smile, like he knew better. Jokes about wives who ran things from the kitchen. Talk about men needing to take full control before people got the wrong idea. I remember one night clearly. We were in the kitchen. Same place I had stood beside him 100 times before, walking him through meetings he had not yet entered. He repeated one of those jokes. And this time, he didn't soften it. He didn't correct it. He didn't look at me the way he used to when he knew something needed to be dismissed. He just laughed. Not loudly, not carelessly, but easily. Like it belonged to him now. That was the first crack. After that, the smaller things began to line up. His thanks started thinning out around the edges. One night at dinner, he cut across me in front of other people and never came back to what I had been saying. The table moved on. So did he. I noticed. He didn't. Another time, he made a material decision without speaking to me first. When I raised it, he didn't argue. He corrected. Not the decision. Me. You don't need to be in every conversation, he said. Not harsh, not loud. Worse, certain. The moment that stayed with me most happened at home. I asked him something simple in our kitchen. Timing on a vendor call, nothing more. He turned toward me with that clipped executive voice men use when they want to remind somebody where they sit in the order of things. I've already handled it. That was all. But it wasn't the words. It was the tone. Final. Closed. Like the conversation itself had been unnecessary. I remember standing there, dish towel still in my hand, feeling something cold settle into place. Not anger. Recognition. Near dawn, when my mother was stable enough for the moment, I left the hospital to shower and change. But when I got home, I walked past the stairs and went straight to the drawer I had barely opened since my father died. The letter was still there. I unfolded it with unsteady fingers and read it again. Not quickly. Not as memory. As instruction. And this time, I didn't stop at the beginning. I went to the line that had been sitting in the back of my mind all along, waiting. If he ever becomes someone I would not recognize, you will know what to do. I stood there holding the paper a moment longer than I needed to, because now I did recognize him, and that made the next step mine. I sat at the edge of the bed with my father's letter open across my knees and read it all the way through for the first time in months. It was not long. That was his way. Thaddeus Beaumont never wasted words trying to make them sound important. If something mattered, he said it plain and expected you to have enough backbone to carry it after he was gone. He did not tell me to punish anybody. He did not tell me what decision to make. He did not write like a man trying to rule from the grave. What he gave me was worse for a dishonest person and better for a clear one. Recognition. He named what I had spent too much time trying not to name for myself. He wrote that trust was not the same thing as surrender. He wrote that a person could be given position without being given the right to hollow out what other people built. He wrote that if character ever split wide enough for me to see through it, then my duty was no longer to preserve appearances. My duty was to protect the company and protect myself. By the time I reached the end, the last excuse I had been carrying for Sylvester was gone. I folded the letter once, then laid it beside me and pulled the old company binder from the lower shelf of my father's dresser. It still had his handwriting on a tab near the spine. I had not looked at those documents in a long time, not because I feared them, but because life had settled into a rhythm that made neglect feel safe. That was my mistake. Stability can make a woman lazy in places she ought to stay awake. The architecture was all still there. My husband had been made president and visible operator, yes. My father had done that deliberately because the industry we worked in still treated male leadership like a language everybody trusted faster. But he had never built anything important on one man's charm. He built layers. I remained co-signatory on the primary operating account. I remained the keeper of the oldest vendor relationships, the ones that had survived recessions, late payments from clients, and all the small humiliations Black-owned businesses learned to absorb without bowing. And deeper in the file, exactly where Nathaniel Griggs had once walked me through it years ago, was the continuity clause. Narrow. Dry. Easy to overlook if you were the kind of man who thought daily control meant the paperwork beneath it no longer mattered. It allowed a temporary shift in operational authority if contract continuity, lender confidence, or governance stability was materially threatened, and the designated continuity party invoked review with documentation. That party was me. I read the clause twice, then 3 times, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too well now. Sylvester had never studied this structure because he had grown lazy inside routine. He mistook being seen for being secured. He mistook familiarity for permanence. I reached for my phone and began pulling up recent correspondence, banking notes, vendor messages, internal updates. My eyes moved faster with every screen, not wild, just sharpening. I was not looking for betrayal anymore. I already had that. I was looking for movement. Then I saw an internal email chain I had been copied on by mistake late the previous evening. At first glance, it wore the kind of language people use when they are trying to make a knife sound like office furniture. Governance modernization, leadership efficiency, structural clarity. There was a board meeting scheduled in 4 days. An outside consultant had been included in the planning, though I had never approved any such role. The tone was what caught me before the details did. Too fast, too coordinated, too comfortable in its assumption that I either would not notice or would notice too late. I opened the thread fully. Then I saw the subject line. One word froze me where I sat. Restructuring. I left the house with my father's letter in my bag, the copied email thread on my phone, and a kind of calm that did not feel natural enough to trust. It was too smooth, too cold. The kind of calm a woman gets when her hurt has finally found a shape. Nathaniel Griggs still kept his office in the same low-brick building my father had used for years, tucked between a tax firm and an insurance office that always seemed to have one dying plant in the window. By the time I got there, morning had settled fully over the city, thin and pale. His receptionist looked up, saw my face, hesitated for half a second, then rose and went to the back without asking for an appointment. That hesitation mattered. It meant I did not look like a woman coming in for routine advice. He came out slower than he used to. Age had taken something from his knees, maybe from his shoulders too, but not from his eyes. Nathaniel had the kind of mind that did not rush toward conclusions. He let them come to him, and only when they were ready to hold weight. He took one look at me and said, "Come in." I handed him the letter first. He read it without interruption, but not quickly. Once through, then again, slower. When he set it down, he did not speak. He reached instead for the rest. The bank message I had sent from the hospital, the internal board notice, the subject line that had stopped me cold. He read each page the same way, careful, deliberate, without reaction. The silence stretched long enough that I felt the first flicker of something I had not expected. Not fear, uncertainty. When he finally leaned back, it was not with certainty, it was with consideration. "You've come in early," he said. That was not what I expected. "Too early?" I asked. "Possibly," he said, "or just in time. I don't know yet." That mattered more than agreement would have. He tapped the letter once. "The clause is real," he said. "Yes, it exists. Yes, it can be invoked." Then he held up a hand slightly, "But not like this." I felt my jaw tighten. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said evenly, "if you walk into a boardroom with what you have right now and try to assert control, you won't be seen as protecting anything. You'll be seen as reacting." He let that sit. "And reaction," he added, "is easy to dismiss." That was the first check. Not support. Correction. I said nothing. He leaned forward again, this time opening the transfer documents, then the continuity section, then a separate folder I had forgotten he still kept. He turned the pages slowly, not explaining yet, just letting the structure sit between us. "Do you know what this clause actually needs to survive scrutiny?" he asked. "Proof," I said. "Not just proof," he corrected. "Timing." He pointed to the page. "Sequence. Commercial impact. External pressure that does not come from you." He looked up at me. Right now, all of this still lives inside your knowledge. That landed harder than anything else. If you move too early, he continued, they won't question him. They'll question you. I felt something shift in my chest. Not doubt. Adjustment. He sat back again, folding his hands loosely this time. Let me ask you something, he said. If I remove your name from this situation and I show these documents to the board, do they act? I didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. No, he said quietly. They ask questions. They delay. They wait for something more concrete. He tapped the board notice. If he gets his restructuring package moving first, he may not win outright. But he can shape the conversation before you ever enter it. And once that happens, everything you say will sound like you're trying to take something back. The wording settled like ice. He was not building a case for me. He was building a warning. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment after that, then said something even colder. Men like your husband don't move first in private. They move when they believe the room is already theirs. I knew he was right. I had been watching Sylvester step into that kind of certainty for years, without naming it. Nathaniel pulled out a legal pad and began writing, not conclusions, but steps. What had to be documented? What had to be triggered externally? What had to be seen, not claimed? He underlined two things twice: vendor confidence, governance sequence. Then he slid the paper across the desk. This is not a move, he said. It's a setup. I looked down at the page. And if I wait too long? I asked. Then he defines the structure before you challenge it. There it was. The balance. Too early, I lose credibility. Too late, I lose position. Nathaniel stood, signaling the meeting was over without saying it. Do not let grief decide your timing, he said. It will rush you into something that looks strong and reads weak. By the time I got home that evening, the house looked exactly like it had the night before. That offended me more than mess would have. Nothing in the room reflected what had shifted. I checked on my mother by phone. The nurse said she was resting. I changed clothes, tied on an apron, and made dinner with the kind of steady hands that would have fooled anybody who had not lived inside my skin. Sylvester came in smelling like cologne and self-satisfaction. Not drunk, just buoyant. He kissed the air near my cheek, loosened his tie, and started talking before he even sat down. Momentum, expansion, new energy. The words came easily, like a man already halfway into a future he believed had no resistance in it. Then he smiled and said business was thriving. I looked at him across my own kitchen and said quietly, I know. He laughed, easy and careless, because he thought I meant ordinary interest. He had no idea I meant I had just been shown exactly how the ground beneath him could be moved, if I did it right. By the next morning, I understood something I had spent too many years resisting. Silence may protect dignity, but it does not protect position. And position, once it slips quietly, does not announce that it is leaving. It simply stops answering when you call on it. I was not building an army. I did not have one. And even if I had, I would not have trusted it. Real help does not arrive all at once wearing loyalty on its face. It comes from people already rooted in the ground beneath you. People who know what they are looking at before you explain it to them. Nathaniel was first because he already understood the structure. Maxine was second, though not in any corporate sense. She had nothing to do with contracts, lenders, or board politics. What she had was something just as important: steadiness. She had been there the night everything in me stopped pretending. She had seen me move without panic, heard no performance in my voice, and witnessed exactly what kind of man my husband chose to be. when urgency asked him to show himself. There are moments in life when the truth needs a witness, even if that witness never speaks. The third person took more effort and more risk. His name was Walter Reed. He had worked operations alongside my father long enough to know the difference between charisma and structure. He had retired 3 years earlier, but retirement had not removed him from influence. It had only made it quieter. People still called him before they made decisions they did not fully trust themselves to make. Respect, however, is not the same as involvement. And involvement is not something men like Walter give away lightly. When I called, he did not agree to help. He agreed to lunch. That told me enough. We met at a small place downtown where the tables were too close together and the coffee always tasted older than it should have. Walter arrived on time, sat down, and did not ask why I had called him. He waited. That was the first test. If I had come to him emotional or uncertain or looking for confirmation, he would have ended the conversation before it started. I handed him the documents, the board notice, the consultant's inclusion, the phrasing around structural clarity, the timing. He read everything without interruption. Once, then again. When he finished, he did not look at me immediately. He set the papers down, adjusted them into a neat stack, and asked the question I should have expected, but still felt sharper than I wanted it to. "Are you sure this is risk?" he said, "and not offense?" I didn't answer right away. Because there was a version of this, a smaller version, where he would be right. Where I had taken something personal and given it weight it did not deserve. That was the danger. That I was not wrong. But early enough to look like I was. He leaned back slightly. "If you're reading this wrong," he continued, "you won't just be mistaken. You'll be visible while you're mistaken." That landed. "And once that happens," he added, "Sylvester doesn't have to beat you. He just has to stand still while the room corrects you." I nodded once. "I know. But knowing and surviving are not the same thing." He studied me for a moment longer, then said something harder. "A lot of people already think you stepped back." That landed deeper. "Not temporarily," he said. "Permanently." I held his gaze. "My silence made that easy," I said. "It did more than that," he replied. "It trained people to stop looking for you." That was the truth I had been avoiding. Not that I had been overlooked, that I had made it possible. Walter picked up the documents again, but this time he read them differently. Slower, more deliberate. Not as a favor to me, but as a problem to be tested. And for a moment, he said nothing. Long enough that I understood something I had not considered before. He could walk away from this, quietly, without disagreement, without commitment. And if he did, that would tell me everything I needed to know about how the rest of the room would move. Only when he reached the continuity language Nathaniel had copied did something shift in his posture. Not much. Just enough. He sat back, looked down again, read the section twice, then he looked up. "Who's the consultant?" "Rashad Pickens." His mouth tightened slightly. "That explains the tone," he said. "Not agreement. Recognition." He tapped the paper once. "This," he said, "is not a move yet. I know. It's positioning. I know. And if you move before it turns into something concrete," he said, "you'll look like you're trying to stop something that hasn't happened. I know." This time, the words felt different. He held my gaze a second longer. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "What do you actually have?" That forced me to answer without protection. "Indicators," I said. "Timing, language, early stage movement, enough to know direction, not enough to prove consequence?" He nodded slowly. "That's a dangerous place to act from." "I'm not acting yet." Another pause. Longer this time. He watched me the way people watch decisions, not people. Then he said, quieter. Good. That was the closest thing to support he gave me. But it came with a condition, not spoken. Understood. Don't be wrong. Through Walter and Nathaniel, the outline began to sharpen. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough. Sylvester had been speaking too openly in the wrong rooms, not formally, not in writing, but enough for people to start repeating the language. Modernization, streamlining, removing legacy constraints, phrases that sound efficient, until you ask who decides what gets removed. Rashad had been doing the rest, not presenting plans, floating them, letting them circulate in side conversations, informal settings, the kind of spaces where ideas are tested before they are owned. That was the real move, not documentation, momentum. Later that afternoon, I sat again in Nathaniel's office while he translated the clause into something simpler. If vendor stability or governance continuity becomes visibly uncertain, he said, tapping the page once, you don't prove it. You respond to it. I listened. That's the difference, he added. You don't lead with the clause. You let the conditions justify it. He closed the file after that. No flourish, no conclusion. Just paper settling into place. Then he looked at me over his glasses. If vendor confidence slips before the board gains clarity, he said, you won't need to argue your position. He paused, then added, but if it doesn't? He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I understood. If it didn't, I would have nothing to stand on. That was the first moment everything aligned, not in certainty, in risk, not because I had support, because I finally understood what I was waiting for and how little room there was to get it wrong. The boardroom was already half full when I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was not my husband. It was Rashad Pickens. He was seated 2 chairs down from where Sylvester stood, jacket open, one arm resting across the back of his chair like the space had been arranged for him in advance. Men like Rashad always look most comfortable in rooms they did not build. That kind of ease is usually borrowed. It holds only as long as nobody asks who authorized it. Then Sylvester looked up and saw me. He did not lose control. That would have been easier to manage. What crossed his face was smaller. A flicker, a break in rhythm, just enough for the people nearest him to notice that something had entered the room he had not accounted for. I took my seat without speaking. One of the board members glanced at me, then at Sylvester, as if expecting him to explain. He didn't. The meeting continued. That was its own answer. It opened the way dishonest transitions often do, with polished language and clean folders, streamlining leadership, reducing overlap, clarifying authority, aligning for future growth. Nobody said removal. Nobody said consolidation. Nobody said what was actually happening. I let them talk. That part mattered. People reveal themselves best when they believe the room is still carrying them. Sylvester spoke first, controlled, measured, careful not to overreach. Rashad followed, adding context in that smooth, rehearsed tone consultants use when they want to sound necessary before they've been proven useful. Company evolution, decision efficiency, modern structure. The words came clean. Too clean. Around the table, I watched hands instead of faces. One member tapped a pen too often. Another leaned back but didn't relax. Counsel said very little. That told me more than agreement would have. When the room paused, I spoke. Not loudly, just clearly. Have vendor continuity concerns been disclosed to the board? The question did not land cleanly. Not because it was unclear. Because it was inconvenient. One of the members shifted in his seat. Another frowned slightly, scanning the documents in front of him as if checking whether he had missed something. Sylvester answered first. too quickly. There are no continuity concerns. I turned slightly, not to him, but to the rest of the table. So that's a no? That created the first real fracture. Not agreement, not opposition, attention. A board member across from me leaned forward. "What specifically are you referring to?" he asked. That mattered, because now the room was asking, not dismissing. "I'm asking whether any vendor-related continuity risks have been formally disclosed," I said. "If not, then the board may be making structural decisions without full visibility." "That's speculative," another member said, sharper than the first. I nodded once. "That's why I'm asking." That slowed them. Sylvester stepped in again, more controlled this time. "We're not operating under any formal continuity risk," he said. "If that changes, it will be addressed appropriately." Appropriately. Future language. Deferral. Before he could settle the room again, I asked the second question. "Have advisory compensation and conflict disclosures regarding Mr. Pickens been fully documented?" This time, the shift was immediate. Not loud, but visible. One member straightened, another turned toward. Counsel without speaking. Rashad smiled, but there was less ease in it now. "My role has been fully appropriate," he said. I looked at him for the first time. That wasn't the question. The smile held, then thinned. Counsel finally spoke, quietly. "Disclosure documentation can be clarified," he said. If necessary." If necessary. That was not dismissal. That was distance. Sylvester's tone tightened slightly. "There's no conflict here," he said. "We're discussing efficiency, not introducing risk." Efficiency. Still the word he wanted the room to hold. I didn't challenge it directly. I moved past it. By the time I asked the third question, no one in that room was pretending I had wandered in on emotion. "Has anyone here reviewed the continuity and risk clause attached to governance instability and contract protection?" That one did not land smoothly. It stalled. Papers shifted. One board member flipped through his packet more quickly than before. Counsel looked down and began reading with real attention. Harold Dent, who had known my father longer than Sylvester had known me, lifted his head and looked directly at Sylvester, not questioning, measuring. Sylvester tried to regain ground. "We're getting distracted," he said. "This discussion is about structure, not hypothetical risk scenarios." "Then it should hold under scrutiny," I said. That didn't win the room, but it stopped him from closing it. Rashad made the mistake next. He spoke again, too quickly, trying to smooth what didn't need smoothing. "We're aligning the company for long-term scalability," he said. "These concerns, while understandable, don't reflect the actual trajectory of the organization." Trajectory. The wrong word, too broad, too detached from what was sitting in front of them. One of the members frowned, another leaned forward again. The room didn't turn. It cooled and cooled. Rooms are more dangerous than loud ones because people stop reacting and start thinking. The rest of the meeting moved differently after that. Slower, more questions, less certainty. No one argued with me directly, but no one dismissed me either. When it ended, nobody lingered. Chairs moved back. Folders closed. Conversations shortened themselves before they could become positions too early. As people filed out, Harold Dent paused beside me, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. He did not look at Sylvester. He looked at me. "Your father built for storms," he said quietly. "Not comfort." Then he kept walking. For the first time, I understood something clearly. The room had not shifted to me. It had shifted away from certainty. And that was enough. Sylvester did not slam the front door when he came in. That would have suggested loss of control too early. Instead, He shut it with a hard, deliberate pull that made the frame shiver once, and then settle. The sound carried through the house like something measured, not careless. I was at the sink with my sleeves pushed up, finishing the dinner dishes I had let sit longer than usual. The kitchen lights were low. The water ran steady. I heard his shoes cross the floor in controlled steps before I saw him. "You embarrassed me in that room." He did not say hello. He did not ask about my mother. His voice was level, but stretched too thin to hold. I kept rinsing the plate in my hand. "I asked you a question," he said. "No," I replied without turning. "You made an accusation." That slowed him. Not stopped, just slowed. The kind of pause a man makes when he realizes the tone he brought into a room may not land the way he expected. He stepped closer, not pacing this time. Holding position. "What you did in there was unnecessary," he said. "You turned a governance discussion into something else." I set the plate beneath the water and reached for another. "What exactly did I turn it into?" He let out a quiet breath through his nose, controlled. "You know how those rooms work," he said. "Timing matters. Alignment matters. You don't just walk in and start raising questions that haven't been properly framed." Properly framed. I dried the rim of a glass with my thumb before setting it aside. "So, the issue is the questions?" "The issue," he said carefully, "is how they were asked." There it was. Not denial. Adjustment. I turned the faucet down slightly and listened. "You blindsided me," he continued. "If you had concerns, there were ways to handle that without creating confusion in front of the board." "Confusion," I repeated. "Yes." I let that sit. He moved a little closer, voice tightening just enough to show strain under the control. "We've been working toward a cleaner structure. That takes coordination. It takes trust. You disrupted that." "We?" I asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. "Leadership," he said. "Advisory input. People who understand where the company needs to go." He chose that carefully. I reached for another plate. "You've been out of the day-to-day for a while," he added. "Things evolve. Processes tighten. You can't expect everything to run the same way it did under your father." That one was deliberate. Placed. I nodded once, more to myself than to him. "So, decisions are already being made." He hesitated. Just enough. "Discussions are happening," he said. "Nothing unusual. Without me." That's not what I said. I didn't respond. I let the silence do the work. He shifted his weight. That was the first real tell, not the words, the movement. "Look," he said, softer now, but not calmer. "You're reading too much into this. We're trying to position the company properly, remove inefficiencies, clarify authority. That's all." Clarify. Authority. I set the plate down in the rack and picked up a towel, drying my hands slowly. "And Rashad?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "What about him? Is he part of those discussions?" A beat. "He's advising," Sylvester said. "That's standard." "On what?" "On structure, on modernization, on areas where we've been overly dependent on informal channels." Informal channels. He still wouldn't say it plainly. That told me more than if he had. I folded the towel once and set it beside the sink. "You should have spoken to me first," he added, the control slipping just a fraction, "before walking into that room and making it look like there's instability where there isn't." I turned slightly then, not fully, just enough to let him see my face. "If there isn't," I said quietly, "then the questions won't hurt anything." That landed. But he didn't step back this time. He leaned in, closer than before. "You don't understand the timing," he said, sharper now. "There are things already in motion. You interfering at this stage I asked questions, I said. You did more than that. What exactly did I do? He stopped. Not because he didn't have words, because the wrong ones were too close to the surface. For a moment, he almost said them. The room went still again. The water had been turned off. The only sound left was the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint shift of air through the vent. Then he changed direction. You made it look like I don't have control, he said. There it was. Not governance, not structure. Control. I held his gaze a second longer than before. Then I said, very quietly, at 2 a.m, you told me my mother wasn't your problem. That landed differently. Not loud, not sharp, final. His face didn't change immediately, but something behind it did. I let the silence sit long enough for it to reach him. Then I added, so don't talk to me about how things should look in a room. That was the first time he stepped back. Not physically. Inside himself. He exhaled once, long and controlled, and the edge he had been holding on to slipped just enough to show. This isn't how this gets handled, he said finally. No, I agreed. It isn't. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else, something less measured. But whatever was rising in him, he swallowed it. He muttered something under his breath I didn't need to hear, turned, and walked out of the kitchen. His steps were heavier now, less controlled as he moved down the hall and up the stairs. I waited until the house settled again. Then I dried my hands completely, walked to the table, and opened Nathaniel's folder. This time, I did not write from memory. I wrote from precision. Date, time, language, position. Not what Sylvester meant, what he chose to say. The first real sign that Rashad was weaker than he sounded came in the speed. Men who are secure in a plan do not rush it into daylight. They let it settle. They let other people repeat it back before they commit it to paper. Structure carries weight quietly when it is real. This did not feel quiet. It felt like something trying to become real before it had earned the right to exist. By midday, the first formal legal opinion arrived. It was written in the polished, bloodless style firms use when they want something unfair to sound settled. My role, according to the letter, was legacy adjacent, historical, ceremonial, respected, of course, but non-operational. The kind of language designed to turn years of real authority into atmosphere. It did not accuse me of anything outright. That would have been careless. It simply repositioned me, softly, professionally, somewhere outside the center of current control. I read it twice, not for what it said, for what it avoided saying. No. Acknowledgement of co-signatory authority. No reference to continuity structure. No mention of exposure. That omission was not an oversight. It was strategy. At the same time, small doors began closing. A calendar notification I would normally receive never came. A decision chain involving one of our regional logistics adjustments moved without my copy. A vendor prep note I had expected to review reached 2 other people and stopped there. Nothing large enough to challenge on its own. That was the method. Narrow the edges. Normalize the absence. Let silence build a new structure before anyone calls it one. I did not object. Not yet. Because objecting too early would confirm the version of me they were trying to write. I made 2 calls. The first was to Daniel Mercer, general counsel for one of the company's 2 largest vendors. Daniel was a cautious man, with a voice so measured it often sounded indifferent to people who did not know better. I had learned a long time ago that his restraint was not distance. It was discipline. I did not rush the conversation. I told him only that there might be internal movement around governance structure, that I was still assessing the scope, and that I wanted to ensure no renewal decisions were made under assumptions that might shift. He let a small silence sit. Then he asked, "Has signature authority changed?" "Not formally." "Has continuity responsibility changed?" "No." Another pause, longer this time. "Are we anticipating a formal change?" he asked. "I don't have confirmation of that," I said. "Only indicators." That mattered. He was not building a conclusion. He was measuring exposure. "We're already in late-stage review on this cycle," he said. "Delays would have implications." "I understand." "And you're asking me to introduce hesitation without formal notice." "I'm asking you not to move faster than clarity." That held, but not cleanly. He exhaled once, quieter than before. "We won't accelerate anything," he said, "but we won't delay internally either. If something formal develops, I'll need to see it quickly." That was not restraint. That was a clock. And clocks do not wait for strategy. The second call did not land as cleanly. Lena Brooks handled commercial operations for the other major vendor, and she had never been a woman who dressed her thinking in politeness. When I explained that there might be movement around authority, she listened. Then she said nothing, long enough for me to understand that she was not choosing her words. She was deciding whether to trust mine. "That's a serious statement," she said at last. "I know. And you're telling me this before it's formal?" "Yes." Another pause. "Because you expect it to become formal?" she said. "I expect clarity will be required." She let that sit longer than Daniel had. Then she did, something Daniel didn't. She pushed back. "We're not in a position to delay on instinct," she said. "If there's a disruption coming, we need to know now, not after it affects delivery." "I understand." "No," she said, sharper now. "I don't think you do. If we pause based on something that doesn't materialize, we absorb that cost. Not you." That landed. Because she was right. For a brief moment, brief enough that no one else would have seen it, I felt the edge of miscalculation. I had moved early, not wrongly, but early enough to create risk if I couldn't follow it with something real. I adjusted. "I'm not asking you to pause," I said carefully. "I'm asking you to watch your exposure." That changed her tone, not softened it, shifted it. "If continuity becomes unclear in writing," she said, "we won't ignore it." That was all she gave me. Not alignment, not trust, a condition. And conditions cut both ways. I thanked her and ended the call. Different responses, same pressure point. But now, a narrowing window. By late afternoon, the pattern sharpened. A follow-up email I should have been copied on reached me indirectly, forwarded without comment by someone who knew better than to leave me blind, but did not want to be seen correcting the structure. The language inside it was careful. The direction was not. Authority was already being described as if it had shifted. Not officially, but confidently. That told me something I did not want to admit too quickly. They were not waiting for approval. They were building reality ahead of it. By evening, the lawyer's envelope arrived at the house by courier, thick paper in a slim fold, the kind of presentation meant to carry weight before it is even opened. I stood at the kitchen counter and read it again from top to bottom. Same message, cleaner phrasing, less room for interpretation. My value was legacy-based, relational, informal, not binding, not central, replaceable. I folded the letter along its original crease and set it beside Nathaniel's folder. Then I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the third ring. "I've seen it," he said. Of course he had. "They're positioning early," I said. "They're trying to," he corrected. I leaned against the counter, looking down at the paper. "It's moving faster than I expected." "That's not a strength," he said. "That's exposure." I let that sit. They're creating language before they secure structure, he continued. If they were confident, they wouldn't need to rush the narrative. There was a pause. What did your vendor calls give you? He asked. Caution, I said. And a clock. That interested him. Explain. They'll wait, I said. But not for long. If we don't give them something real, they'll move based on what's in front of them. And right now, I looked at the letter. Their version is in front of them. Silence. Then, that's the pressure point, he said. I straightened slightly. And if we miss it? Then this, he said calmly, becomes truth by repetition. That was the first time the day pushed back, not against Sylvester, against me. I had moved, but I had not secured, and in rooms like this, movement without proof is risk. So, timing matters, I said. Timing is the only thing that matters right now, he replied. I looked down at the folder, at the letter, at the quiet way the house held everything in place as if nothing had shifted. They moved faster than I expected, I said again. This time I heard it clearly. Not observation, adjustment. Nathaniel was quiet for a beat. Then he said, Then don't let them turn speed into truth. The line went still, and for the first time that day, I felt the edge of the gap I was standing on. If I moved too slowly, they would define the company without me. If I moved too quickly, I would confirm their version of me. I ended the call, set the phone down, and stood there a moment longer than I needed to. Then I reached for the folder again, because now I understood something clearly enough to act on it. Speed alone was not their advantage, but if I mishandled it, it would become mine. By the time I got back to the hospital that afternoon, the sharpest edge of fear had passed. What remained was quieter and harder to carry. My mother looked smaller in recovery than she ever had in her own house. Not weak. She would have rejected that word even half asleep, but reduced by the machinery around her. The blanket was tucked too high. The light was too soft. Flowers had been placed near the window, and every now and then I could hear the paper around the stems shift when the vent pushed air through the room. Beneath that were the other sounds. People only notice once. Panic leaves. The dry hiss of oxygen. Rubber soles passing the doorway. A cart rattling somewhere farther down the hall. She was awake when I walked in. Not strong, but present. I sat beside her and took her hand, and for a few moments neither of us said anything. We had never been a family that used many words to prove love. My father had not. My mother did not. I had carried that into my marriage and watched it become something else. She squeezed my fingers once, her eyes still resting somewhere near the window. Then she said, almost as if she were picking up a thought she had set down years ago, Your father used to say, the loudest man in the room had already lost the argument inside himself. That was all. But this time, it did not land as memory. It landed as instruction. Not about Sylvester, about timing. Loud men rush. They fill space before they secure it. They mistake movement for control. I sat there holding her hand, feeling something shift. Not soften, not break. Align. My father, not as memory, but as structure. In the way he had built. In the way he had prepared for something I had hoped would never come. And beneath that, something I had been refusing to name cleanly. The marriage. Not the version I showed people. The one I had been managing. The years I had spent translating Sylvester into something easier to live with. Adjusting tone, softening edges, stepping back just enough each time to keep peace from breaking. Peace, I realize now, that had not belonged to me. My mother's hand relaxed in mine as she drifted back toward sleep. I stayed long enough to be sure her breathing had settled, then eased my fingers free, adjusted the blanket, and stood. I did not linger. That mattered, because staying longer would have been about comfort, and comfort was not what I needed. In the hallway, my phone buzzed. Not a call, an email, Nathaniel. Subject line, draft review, vendor position language. That pulled me back. By the time I reached the car, the emotional space had already begun to close. I shut the door, let one brief wave of it pass through me, sharp, contained, and then opened the laptop. We worked in pieces, not conclusions. Language, what could be said, what could not be overstated, what had to remain neutral enough to be respected, but precise enough to force reaction. The first draft went out just before dusk. That was earlier than I would have preferred, but waiting carried its own risk now. The response did not come immediately. That mattered, because silence at this stage was no longer neutral. It meant evaluation. The first reply came later, measured, careful. The vendor did not commit. They did not escalate. They asked for clarification, recognized continuity authority, governance positioning, confirmation that no material changes were underway that would affect renewal integrity. It was not support. It was distance, and distance in the wrong direction becomes withdrawal. The second response took longer, long enough for me to check my phone twice more than I should have. That was the first crack in my control. Small, but real. When it came, it was narrower, more direct. Renewal would not proceed without clarity, not delayed indefinitely, not refused, conditioned. That was the word that mattered. Conditioned meant leverage, but only if I moved before the condition hardened into hesitation. I read both messages twice. They were not aligned, not fully. One was cautious, the other was protective. That difference told me everything. The room outside the company had not decided yet. They were waiting, watching, letting the company define itself before they committed to it, which meant if Sylvester defined it first, they would follow him. I sat back in the driver's seat, the glow from the parking garage lights flattening everything into stillness. My phone buzzed again, a forwarded message, internal, a thread I had not been included in. That part mattered more than the content, because exclusion is not an accident at that level. It is design. I opened it, read once, then again. The language had shifted, not formally, but enough. Authority was being described differently, as if something had already changed, as if I had already been moved, and the structure was simply catching up. I closed the laptop slowly, set the phone down in my lap, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, I did not think about what I felt. I thought about what I needed to force. Nothing had been secured yet. Not the vendors, not the board, not the structure. Everything was still in motion, which meant one thing. The company was no longer standing on reputation. It was standing on what could be proven. And right now, that proof was still being written. I reached for my phone again, not to check it, to act. Because if I waited for clarity, I would be waiting inside someone else's version of it. 48 hours after that 2 a.m. phone call, Nathaniel filed the protective review package. He did it the way he said he would. Cleanly, quietly, with no flourish that could be mistaken for revenge trying to wear business clothes. The filing laid out documented governance instability, continuity exposure, vendor renewal risk, and my formal invocation of the continuity clause already sitting inside the company's structure, whether Sylvester had chosen to remember it or not. By then, the bank relationship manager had already been on notice since 8 o'clock that first morning. That part mattered. Banks do not behave like movies. They do not slam down vault doors because something personal has broken inside a household. They move inside permissions, inside language that already exists, inside risk, which means they rarely move all at once. The first response was not a stop. It was a question, a flag transaction, a request for confirmation. A routine pause dressed in polite language that gave a man one chance to explain himself before anything more formal followed. Under existing protections, internal review protocols were triggered on unusually large discretionary movement, tied to accounts requiring co-signatory awareness, not a freeze. Not yet. Just enough friction to slow something down that had been moving too confidently. Sylvester did not know any of that when he started his day. I was at home when the first crack opened. I had just stepped out of the shower and was toweling off when my phone buzzed with an update from the hospital. My mother had slept, eaten a little, and was holding steady. I stood there reading that message twice, letting relief move through me in a way I did not trust enough to enjoy fully. Then my other phone lit up on the dresser. Sylvester. I let it ring. Then again. Then again. By the third call, I knew something had interrupted his rhythm. By the fifth, I knew it. It had not resolved cleanly. I got dressed without rushing, not slowly, just without urgency. By the time I buttoned my blouse, there were 6 missed calls. A text came in after that. Call me, then another. Where are you? Not anger yet. Confusion. I did not answer. What I learned later came in pieces, not all at once, and that mattered more than anything. The first transfer had not failed. It had stalled, flagged, routed for secondary confirmation, held just long enough for someone to ask whether the authority behind it aligned with the documentation now sitting in review. That was the beginning. He pushed again, adjusted the amount, reframed the purpose, tried to move it through a different channel tied to the same restructuring effort. Consulting fees, preliminary legal positioning, early-stage movement that assumed nobody would slow him down long enough to question the sequence. That was when the second layer engaged. Not loudly, just formally. Pending clarification of co-signatory awareness and governance alignment, the transaction would require confirmation before release. Not denied, not approved. Suspended in that narrow space where confidence starts to slip. That was the first real hit. Minutes later, one of the major vendors reached out. Not alarmed, not accusatory, careful. They requested confirmation that no changes to recognized operating authority were underway that might affect renewal sequencing. He answered them poorly, because he did not yet understand the shape of what he was standing inside. That answer triggered the second call. More formal this time. A request for written clarification before proceeding further. That was the second hit. Confidence does not collapse with noise. It leaves in layers. By the time my phone started ringing again, the tone had changed. Not confused anymore. Sharp. What did you do? I let it ring. Then again. Then again. By the time I sat down on the edge of the bed to put on my shoes, the calls had stacked into something heavier. His assistant once. Sylvester twice in quick succession. Then 3 times, back to back. A voicemail. Another call. A new message came through. Call me now. Then another. What is going on? Still not quite panic, but close enough to touch it. I did not answer. Near 1 o'clock, Maxine knocked and brought over soup I had not asked for. She set it on the kitchen counter, looked once at the phone vibrating against the table, and said, "That man just ran into something he can't talk his way around." I almost smiled. By mid-afternoon, the pressure had settled fully into him. The bank had not released the funds. The vendors had not moved forward. And for the first time, he did not have a clean explanation that would make all of it behave. The calls changed after that. Shorter, closer together, less controlled. By late afternoon, the missed calls were approaching 50. Not because he missed me, not because he was trying to repair anything, because the company had stopped responding to him like it belonged to him alone, because systems he had treated like background noise had stepped forward and asked him to prove himself. When I finally answered one call, I did not speak first. I listened. His breathing hit the line before his words did, tight, uneven, trying to pass as controlled and failing in small places he would not have noticed a week earlier. "What did you do?" he said. This time, there was no confusion left in it, only pressure. I turned toward the window and looked out at the quiet street, the afternoon sun lying across the pavement like nothing in the world had shifted at all. Then I said, very quietly, "I didn't do anything." I let that sit for half a second. Then I finished, "I just stopped fixing it for you." The first real pause in my momentum did not feel like rest. It felt like resistance. 72 hours. That was how long it took for the system to remind me that pressure does not move in one direction. It bends, it absorbs, and when it finds its footing again, it pushes back. It came just after I had begun to feel the structure tightening in the right places, which is exactly why it mattered. Real systems do not surrender cleanly the first time pressure is applied. They hesitate. They test whether what they are seeing is temporary or structural before they decide which side of it they belong to. This time, the system tested me. Sylvester's legal team moved faster than they had before, because by then, the damage was no longer theoretical. The bank friction was real. The vendor hesitation was real. The board could no longer pretend this was contained inside a marriage. So his lawyers did what capable lawyers do when they cannot win outright. They made me look like the problem. The filing did not challenge the protective review directly. That would have failed too quickly. Instead, they reframed the timing, argued that while concerns might exist, implementation of any authority shift required fuller internal clarification. That premature action could introduce instability where process might otherwise resolve it. A procedural argument, clean, reasonable, dangerous, because it did not have to be true. It only had to sound responsible to the right people at the right moment. For 3 days, it worked. The board slowed, not in panic, in caution. And caution, when introduced at the right moment, can feel almost identical to doubt. One member who had leaned toward me in the earlier meeting began asking different questions. Not hostile ones, careful ones. Questions about sequencing, about optics, about whether the situation had escalated faster than it should have. Another stopped calling me directly. That one mattered more. Silence is not neutral in rooms like that. It is positioning. I did not need Nathaniel to explain why. Rashad had changed his posture. He stopped sounding bold. He started sounding reasonable. That was the more dangerous version of him. The language inside the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the ground under my feet. Governance protection became internal disagreement. Continuity risk became interpretation. My actions became premature escalation. And then the line came, not in writing, in conversation, a marital dispute dressed in structure, a wife reacting to loss of influence, a personal fracture reframed as operational concern. That line did not need to convince everyone. It only needed to give enough people permission to hesitate. Sylvester held on to that hesitation exactly the way drowning people hold on to anything that floats. If he could keep the board uncertain long enough, the pressure might ease, the vendors might wait, the bank might relax its posture. And for a short window, it almost worked. That was the danger. Not that he was stronger, that he was just credible enough to slow consequence until it looked optional. I did not panic, but I felt it. The drag. The way momentum thickens without announcing itself. The way responses stretch longer between emails. The way certainty starts to sound like careful language instead of decision. On the second day, something shifted that I could not ignore. One of the vendors did not just hesitate. They stepped back. Not publicly, not formally, but enough. Their internal counsel requested additional clarification on continuity exposure and governance authority before proceeding with renewal sequencing. The tone was measured, but the meaning was not. They were preparing to protect themselves from me, not from him. That was the first moment the ground moved under my feet. If they decided I was the instability, not the protection, everything reversed. Maxine called that evening just to ask if I had eaten. I told her yes, even though I hadn't. My mother was stronger, though still tired. And I kept my voice level with her because there was no reason to give her the weight of something she could not influence. Nathaniel did not reassure me. He corrected me. "They're not trying to win," he said. "They're trying to make you look early." That landed differently. Early. Not wrong. Premature. And premature action is easier to dismiss than bad action. Walter was quieter than usual. That concerned me more than anything, because men like Walter do not go quiet unless they are watching to see who reveals themselves under pressure. On the third day, the delay deepened. A follow-up from the second vendor came through, not a withdrawal, but not a commitment either. They were waiting. Watching how the board framed the situation before deciding where to stand. That was the closest I came to losing ground. Not because anything had shifted decisively, because nothing had. Stalemate is not neutral. It erodes whoever is being questioned more closely. And in that moment, that was me. I stood in my kitchen that afternoon with my hand resting on the back of a chair, reading the same line twice, then a third time, and understanding something I had not allowed myself to consider before. If this held, if this uncertainty lasted, I would not lose loudly. I would lose quietly, through hesitation, through delay, through being reclassified as unnecessary. Then Sylvester's side made the mistake that ended it. They tried to stabilize the narrative with volume, to justify the restructuring timeline and reinforce Rashad's position. They submitted a comprehensive packet into review. Billing summaries, advisory notes, draft governance language, recommendation threads, internal correspondence meant to demonstrate continuity of planning. It looked thorough. It was not disciplined. The problem with volume is that it invites attention. And attention does not move quickly. It reads. The first pass did not expose them. The second did. Patterns began to surface, not crimes. Not anything dramatic enough for headlines, but enough to make disciplined people uncomfortable. Rashad's influence appeared in places it should have been more formally disclosed. Advisory input blurred into structural shaping without proper separation. Billing overlapped in ways that raised questions about scope. Recommendations circulated before they were formally introduced. It was not illegal. It was careless. And in rooms built on oversight, carelessness is often more dangerous than intent. Outside counsel shifted first, not publicly. Internally, the language changed, from defensive to protective, from explanation to exposure. They did not accuse. They recommended. Which is more powerful? An immediate audit review. Nathaniel called me just before 6. I was still standing in the same place I had been an hour earlier, the house too quiet for the weight of what had been sitting in it all day, when his name lit up the screen. His voice was even, but heavier. "They've authorized a preliminary audit," he said. Scope is still being defined. That mattered. Not full, not final, but moving. For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I was surprised, because I understood exactly what had changed. Up until then, Sylvester had been fighting for narrative. And for 72 hours, he almost made it stick. Now the room had shifted to process. And process does not care who sounds convincing. It cares what can be traced. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Is it contained? For now, Nathaniel said. If it widens, it won't be quiet. I let that settle. Felt the weight of how close that line had come to breaking the wrong way. Then I said, very calmly, let it run. The audit did not explode the company. That was never the danger. What it did was slower, and in some ways more uncomfortable for the people who had been relying on confidence and selective memory to carry them forward. It thinned credibility. Not evenly, not cleanly, but enough. The findings did not arrive as a verdict. They arrived as questions. Enough irregularity to make trust more expensive. Enough looseness in process to make continued certainty look careless. Enough documentation to force people who preferred instinct to sit with paper longer than they wanted to, but not enough to destroy anyone outright. That mattered. Because ambiguity gives people somewhere to hide, and hiding buys time. Rashad weakened first, not immediately, not in a way that could be pointed to and named in a single sentence, but his presence began to feel heavier in the documents, more frequent, less clearly defined, advisory notes that drifted too close to structural direction, recommendations that appeared before formal introduction, billing that overlapped in ways that were not clean, even if they were not explicitly improper. None of it, on its own, was disqualifying. Together. It made him difficult to defend. That was the shift. Not exposure. Pressure. Sylvester's position did not collapse. It tightened. The audit did not say he was wrong. It said the structure around him was not disciplined enough to justify confidence. And for a man who had built his authority on control, that distinction was more dangerous than accusation, because it forced the room to choose. The board reconvened on a Thursday afternoon under fluorescent lights that made everyone look more tired than they intended to admit. This time, the room carried weight. Not tension alone, liability. The difference matters. One board member leaned forward early, voice measured but firm. The audit does not justify immediate displacement of leadership, he said. Stability still matters. Abrupt change introduces its own risk. Another agreed. Not fully, but enough. He suggested a phased approach. Shared authority, a monitored transition instead of a decisive shift, something that preserved appearance while allowing internal correction. Then a third voice entered, sharper than the others. We need to be careful, he said. We are very close to turning internal disagreement into structural instability. If this escalates improperly, we expose the company externally in ways that are far more damaging than anything in that audit. That one landed. Because it reframed the risk. Not Sylvester. Me. For a moment, brief but real, the room tilted. Because he was not wrong. Handled badly, this could become exactly what they were trying to avoid. A self-inflicted fracture. I let them speak. All of them. That part mattered. Because once people commit to a position out loud, they have to either defend it or retreat from it in front of witnesses. By the time the fourth voice joined in, the pattern was clear. Not defense of Sylvester. Fear of consequence. Fear of being the ones who made the wrong call too early. That is where most decisions fail, not on facts, on timing. When it was my turn, I did not interrupt the narrative they had started. I narrowed it. I opened the binder, laid the documents out in sequence. Vendor hesitation, not hypothetical. Documented, bank friction, not personal. Procedural, advisory overlap, not illegal. Undisciplined, governance pressure, not emotional. Structural. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Sylvester. I spoke to the room. Shared authority, I said, does not reduce risk. It distributes confusion. That slowed them, but not enough. One of the earlier voices leaned forward again. That assumes the alternative is clean, he said, which it isn't. What you're proposing introduces its own instability. There it was, direct. I turned one page. Vendors are not asking for balance, I said. They are asking for clarity. Another page. The bank is not responding to personality. It is responding to structure. He didn't sit back. He held the position. And if we overcorrect? He asked. If we signal instability where it could have been managed internally? That was the closest the room came to turning against me. Because now the risk had weight. Now it had consequence. I closed the binder and answered him directly. If we delay clarity, I said, we don't preserve stability. I let the room sit inside that. Then finished, we misrepresent it. Silence followed. Not agreement, evaluation. Counsel spoke next. More carefully than before, not defending, not dismissing, clarifying exposure. The issue is no longer internal alignment, he said. It's external interpretation. That threshold has already been crossed. That shifted something. Not decisively, but enough. One of the members who had argued for shared authority leaned back slightly. Not agreement, but retreat. Another asked a narrower question, then another. The conversation tightened. And when conversations tighten, they stop protecting comfort. They start protecting outcomes. Sylvester tried to speak then, measured, controlled, framing everything as premature escalation, emphasizing continuity, emphasizing confidence, emphasizing the danger of overreaction. For a moment, he almost regained ground. Because he sounded reasonable. Because he always sounded reasonable when he wasn't being challenged directly. Then one question cut across him. Not mine. Can you confirm, a board member asked, that all advisory involvement has been fully disclosed and contained within appropriate scope? It was a simple question. Clean, traceable. He answered, but not cleanly enough, and that was the moment the room shifted. Not to me, away from him. By the time the vote was called, the room was still divided. That mattered. Because this was not a decision built on comfort. It was built on risk tolerance. The board formalized me as operating authority on a protective basis, pending structured review. Not permanent, not uncontested, but real. Rashad's involvement was suspended immediately, pending further review, not severed outright. That came later. Sylvester did not react, not visibly, but I saw it. In the stillness that came too quickly, in the way he stopped trying to shape the room, in the way control left him in increments. I did not look at him again. I didn't need to. When the meeting ended, no one lingered. That was how I knew it had cost something. Not just him. Everyone. I walked out without stopping for conversation. The parking garage was cool and dim, and for a few seconds after I got into the car, I could not bring myself to turn the key. My hands stayed on the steering wheel longer than they needed to. Not shaking, just holding. Because winning something like that does not feel like victory. It feels like responsibility, being transferred, with no room left to pretend. I started the engine, and instead of going home, I drove straight to Nathaniel Griggs's office to file for divorce. He found out about the divorce before I said a word to him. That did not surprise me. Men like Sylvester always hear through panic first, not through honesty, not through reflection. through the sudden change in how other people answer their calls, through the tone inside a hallway, through the way a receptionist says, one moment when the moment already means something has slipped beyond repair. By the time I got home, I knew he knew. The front room lights were on, every one of them, too bright for that hour. The house looked staged for conflict. I stepped inside and heard voices before I shut the door. His and another man's. Loud enough to fill space. Loud enough to announce to the walls that shame had entered and needed company. When I turned the corner into the living room, Sylvester was standing, near the fireplace with one hand braced on the mantel like the room might tilt if he let go. Beside him was Curtis Lang, one of those men who always arrived dressed like certainty and left as soon as consequences required character. I had seen him at dinners, at golf events, at those expensive private gatherings where mediocre men praised one another for traits stronger people call recklessness. Curtis spoke first. "This has gone too far." He said it with the confidence of a man used to entering trouble after the damage is done, and talking as if volume can reverse paperwork. Sylvester looked worse than I had ever seen him, not humbled. Men like him do not arrive at humility that quickly. He looked stripped. Humiliation had gotten to him, but he was still trying to shape it into force because force was the last language he trusted. "You filed for divorce?" he said. I set my bag on the chair by the door and took off my coat. Curtis stepped forward half a pace. "What you've done here is overreach. Corporate overreach, legal overreach, marital retaliation. You don't get to wreck a man's name because you're upset." I looked at him, then at Sylvester, and said nothing. That silence changed the room more than shouting would have. Sylvester started pacing. "You think this is smart? You think this doesn't come back on you too? The board can revisit decisions. Reviews get challenged. Vendors calm down. This can still be fixed." I let him keep talking. That was the useful thing about desperate men. They believe movement is momentum, even when they are only circling the same fear in different words. Curtis joined in again, talking about damaged reputations, recoverable decisions, unnecessary escalation. He used phrases like he was trying to build a ladder out of sound. I waited until both of them had spent enough of themselves to make honesty easier. Then I spoke. "The consultant is gone," I said. "The audit stands. The vendor. Conditions are documented. The board vote is done. The bank review trail exists. The divorce is filed." Neither man interrupted. "And every casual thing you treated like private maneuvering," I said, looking first at Sylvester and then at Curtis, "now lives in formal records." That was the moment Curtis went quiet. Not because decency woke up in him. Men like that understand consequence long before they understand right and wrong. I watched it happen in his face. The quick math. The retreat. The realization that this was no longer a room where boldness could save anybody. Sylvester saw it too. And that hurt him more than anything I could have said. Without Curtis's noise beside him, he looked suddenly smaller. Not in body, in posture, in certainty. In the sad, late way a man looks when he realizes the performance is over and the audience has started checking the exits. Then he asked the stupidest question possible. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" I looked at him for a long time, not angrily, not theatrically, just long enough to make him sit inside the memory he had discarded because it was inconvenient to his comfort. Then I said, quietly, "I did. At 2 a.m., remember?" The divorce moved only after the company was secure. That part mattered to me more than people around me understood at first. Pain had not set the order of things. Pain would have rushed, shouted, grabbed at whatever was closest, and called that relief. I had lived too long inside other people's assumptions to let injury make my decisions look impulsive now. Strategy had set the timeline. Strategy had protected the company first. After that, the rest could proceed. Not without cost, just without risk to what my father spent his life building. The board finalized the longer-term restructuring 3 weeks later. By then, the tone inside the company had changed completely. Not warm, not celebratory, cleaner. New controls went in quietly. Disclosure rules tightened. Approval paths that had been left too loose under Sylvester's confidence were redrawn with a seriousness that did not need speeches to prove itself. Continuity mattered again more than personality. Process mattered more than performance. People who had once spoken in vague language about modernization suddenly became very interested in precision, which is one of the many ways fear dresses itself up as professionalism after the fact. But not everything reset cleanly. That was the part no one said out loud. Some relationships did not return, not because they were broken, but because they had been revealed. There were people who had watched too long without speaking. People who had waited to see which direction power would settle before deciding where they stood. I still worked with them. But I no longer mistook proximity for loyalty. That was one of the costs. Sylvester was removed the same way he had once liked to describe strong leadership decisions, cleanly, and without unnecessary noise. There were no handcuffs, no shouting match in the lobby, no cameras waiting outside the building. Real consequences rarely arrive with the drama people imagine for them. More often, they come in signed papers, narrowed options, and the quiet, humiliating discovery that the world keeps moving after your name loses its special weight. He walked away with what was contractually his and nothing more. Once stripped of illusion, that turned out to be very little. I heard through quiet channels that Rashad had been trying to explain the situation as a misunderstanding of scope. That made sense. Men like him never admit overreach when they can call it confusion instead. But boardrooms are less forgiving than private dinners, and swagger does not read well once written records enter the room. His association with the company was severed without ceremony. After that, his name stopped surfacing in the places he liked to imagine himself influential. Sylvester's social orbit shrank faster than I expected. Then again, maybe not. Men who gather around another man's ego rarely stay long enough to witness the arithmetic once that ego stops paying dividends. The dinners thinned, the invitations quieted. The urgent brotherhood of his loudest supporters became what those things usually become under pressure, a scattering. There was a moment, brief, but real, when I wondered if I had expected more. Not from them, from him. Some sign that he understood what he had done, not publicly, not for anyone else, just once. Honestly, that did not come. And something in me, not loud, not dramatic, closed where that expectation had been. At home, Maxine brought over food one evening in 2 glass dishes covered with foil. She did not ring twice or stand in the doorway making sympathy into a performance. She handed me the dishes, asked how my mother was feeling, and said, "You need to eat something that didn't come from stress." Then she went back home. That kind of care will humble you if you are wise enough to notice it. My mother was stronger by then. Not fully recovered, but enough like herself that the room felt steadier around her. One evening, she sat in the living room with a blanket over her knees while a local business segment ran a short piece on leadership stabilization at the company. They used all the tidy language television prefers: transition, confidence, continuity. She watched the screen without smiling, without commenting, without asking for the remote. Then she looked at me, just once. It was not pride exactly, not relief either. It felt more layered than that. Blessing, witness, and something quieter, recognition. Not of what I had done, of what it had required. A few days later, the mail came in with a plain envelope among the bills and circulars. The return address meant nothing to me. For one suspended second, standing there at the kitchen counter, I thought it might be some last piece of cleanup from the past. Another explanation, another demand, another tired attempt to rearrange what had already been settled. Or worse, an apology that I didn't need anymore. It was not. I opened it slowly and realized it was about something Sylvester had never understood at all: the future. The letter was from a young woman named Imani Fletcher. I sat with it in my hands longer than I expected to, not because it was confusing, but because it was so clear. She was finishing business school. She had heard, through industry circles and one professor who still knew people who knew my father's name, that the company had gone through a leadership stabilization. She wrote that she was reaching out carefully, aware that timing mattered. She did not ask for anything with entitlement. She asked whether there might be room for a conversation, an internship if one existed, mentorship if that was more realistic, a chance to learn inside a company with roots strong enough to survive pressure. The wording was respectful, but not timid, hopeful, but not naive, hungry in the right way. I read it once standing at the kitchen counter. Then I carried it with me to my father's office and sat down at his desk for the first time in a way that felt different from all the times I had entered that room before. I had sat there in grief. I had sat there in caution. I had stood there behind louder people and stronger masks and called that patience because it was easier than calling it what it really was. This time, I sat there as the visible steward of what he built. The wood still had the same small marks near the right edge where his watch used to tap when he was reading contracts too fast. The lamp still cast that amber circle he preferred over harsh ceiling light. The room smelled faintly of paper, polish, and time. Imani's letter rested in front of me, and for a little while I let myself think through everything the past days had stripped bare. The phone call at 2 a.m. The coldness in Sylvester's voice when my mother needed help, and he decided convenience mattered more than character. The hospital lights, Maxine in her house shoes and sweater, showing up without questions and without delay, when the man sleeping under my roof would not. My father's letter. The boardroom shifting under the weight of truth. The sound of panic in a man who had once thought power meant being obeyed instead of being trusted. And beneath all of that, something even quieter than anger. The years I spent building a man who slowly stopped recognizing the hands that steadied him. I did not hate him sitting there. That season had already passed. What I felt was clearer than hate and more useful than vindication. I felt finished. Finished with explaining. Finished with adjusting, finished with shrinking so something unstable could feel secure. I opened the drawer where I had kept my father's letter and took it out again, smoothing the old page across the desk with both hands. The paper had softened at the folds from years of being opened carefully and returned to the dark. I read only enough to feel his steadiness move through me again. Not instructions. Not permission, just foundation. For a moment, I held that old page in my hands. Then I placed it back in the drawer carefully. This time, before closing it, I laid Imani Fletcher's letter on top of it. That small act said more to me than any speech could have. Protection had never been the whole legacy. Continuation was. My father had not spent his life building something durable, so I could spend the rest of mine proving that men had misjudged me. Survival mattered. Recovery mattered. But neither one was the end of anything worth inheriting. I pulled a sheet of company stationery toward me and took out a pen. I did not write anything sentimental. No grand declarations. No performance. Dressed up as wisdom. I wrote the way serious opportunities deserve to be answered. Clearly, carefully, with respect for the future and no fear of naming it. I told her I had received her letter. I told her I appreciated the way she had written it. I told her there was room for a conversation, and that if she was as prepared to learn as she sounded, then yes, there might be room for more than that. When I finished, I sat back and looked once around the office. The room did not feel haunted anymore. It felt used, occupied, alive in a different way. Not by memory, by direction. For a brief moment, just a moment, I thought about how close I had come to losing all of it. Not to failure, to hesitation, to silence, to waiting for permission that was never mine to ask for. Then the thought passed. Because that version of me no longer had a place here, I set the pen down, closed the folder, and reached for the next file waiting on the desk. Because this, all of this, was never just about holding what I was given. It was about deciding what deserved to continue through me and what did not. My father built this. I protected it. Now, I'm ready to grow it.